Hi there. We have Dr. Peter Hayward with us here. Peter's down in Melbourne, and he and I've known one another about 20 years or so. We first met, I think, in Taiwan in 2005, and it's been a lovely journey, a parallel journey in all sorts of ways with Peter and I. Peter actually, Dr. Peter Hayward, was part of the Swinburne crew who ran and what was the formal title of that, Peter?
It had three titles, but you would probably call it the Master of Strategic Foresight.
The Master of Strategic Foresight, and it was Richard Slaughter there, Joe Voris, and a number of key futurists working in the field today went through that course. That's in Australia particularly. Then Peter had transferred to doing something which he loves doing, and he does it really well, which is interviewing people himself at the TFX. That's TFX's Frank. FuturePod with you, and now it's FuturePod X, in which I was fortunate enough to be dragged into and had a lot of fun with you guys. So, Peter, tell us more, because mine's a very potted history of who you are. How did you get into futures? What are your passions?
Yeah, great question, Marcus, and thanks for the invitation, and also congratulations for the initiative to do this course. So yeah, who am I? I'm going to describe myself as fairly typical boomer child of Depression parents. I was the first of our family to get to a university, courtesy of the reforms brought in by Gough Whitlam in the 70s. And my parents impressed on me the importance of getting a government job, given their own experience of how precarious the world can be when you're not in the government. So I finished up studying for a university, working in the tax office, and I spent a quarter of a century there learning about complex organisations, technical, aspects of life, but also I grew up as a human being, got married, and then probably towards the end of my professional career in the tax office, I started to bump into what I now know as situational depression, midlife crisis, whatever you call it, where I kind of thought I was this really smart, powerful, influential person, and you realise you built your house on sand.
Yeah.
And in the process of then sort of throwing myself into what the hell I did, a psychiatrist said to me, "You're just bored with who you are. Go out and get interested in yourself." And I threw myself crash test dummy like into lots of things: meditation, personal development, art, the whole shooting match. And as part of that crazy journey, I finished up returning to the tax office after having taken a short time, and I was going to resign because I knew I didn't want to go back into that kind of technical environment. But a friend of mine said, "Look, you're weird. You think differently. We've got this intelligence unit. I think you should run it." So I kind of said, "Yeah, fine. That's 6 months. I'll kind of, cross the financial year and resign." And I started doing futures work without knowing what the hell futures was. And as I had Kees van der Heyden's book on scenarios, and I also had a copy of Richard Slaughter's Futures for the Third Millennium. And they were my textbooks, so to speak. I didn't know I was doing intelligence, strategic conversations, as Kees van der Heyden would call it, very, very potted scenarios to kind of get people thinking. But I was trying to get all the spooks in the tax office to talk to one another and talk across the silos. And it was and learning about Chatham House rules, where you only can have people talk honestly when they know it's safe to talk, that kind of thing. Yeah. And I finished up, the bizarre happenstance that I found futures was I had a boss who said, "Oh, look, I've got this ticket to this breakfast of the Futures Foundation in Sydney and I can't go. I want you to go and represent us." And I'm going, "Okay, fine." So flew to Sydney, went to the breakfast, and I happened to sit next to Jan Lee Martin.
Ah, okay.
And I didn't know who Jan Lee Martin was, and she certainly didn't know who I was. And these are the days when we used to carry briefcases. I can imagine, Marcus, you probably never had a briefcase.
No, I missed the briefcase.
But I had a briefcase, and I wanted to get something out of the briefcase. Those stupid things, briefcases. And invariably what happened when you had a briefcase, and whatever you wanted was at the bottom of the briefcase. So So the kind of ritual you would do is you would open the briefcase, put it on the floor, because the stupid thing would just drop everything on the floor. And then you would lift everything out onto the table where you were to find the thing you wanted in the briefcase. And one of the things I lifted out and got out of the way was Futures for the Third Millennium.
Yeah.
And I plonked this on the table just because I was looking for a pen or whatever it was I was looking for. And this woman next to me, Jan Lee Martin, who I now became great friends with, said to me, "Oh, you got Richard's book. Do you know Richard?" And I've kind of got the shock of my life and looked at her and thought, "No, I don't know Richard." And she said, "Oh, no, he's a friend of mine." "Oh, okay, right." So, yeah. "Where are you from?" "I'm from Melbourne." "Oh, okay. Did you know he's starting a course in this in Melbourne?" I said, "What?" She said, No, he's doing a course in this in Melbourne." So I kind of put everything back in the briefcase. I have no idea what we talked about at the Futures Foundation, but as soon as I got back home, I did a bit of sleuthing and I found there was a course starting at Swinburne.
Yeah.
So I rang up. Richard answered the phone. I said, "When's the course start?" And he said, I think it's something like next week, Monday. I said, "I'll be there." So I was in the first class. There were only 4 of us in the classroom, sitting opposite Richard Slaughter with Joe Voros and 2 other people. And that's how I fell into Futures. And by the end of the first 3 days, I'd found my tribe. I'd found my purpose. Yeah. Richard quickly converted me to a PhD so he could go home.
Yep, smart move.
And then I got my PhD and then ran the course for the remaining time before I walked out of university around about the end of 2018.
Yeah.
And then after that, I started FuturePod because I wanted to keep the conversations going.
So tell us about Futures Pod. What you say you want to keep the conversations going, and I know that you and I have a real affinity for story and that kind of thing. Can you expand on that for us, please, Peter?
Well, again, I'm sure like a lot of your people that are going to come and do your course is that we tend to think of Futures as a thinking better, thinking sharper, thinking. Yeah, it's just about thinking. It's about being a better thinker, whatever better means, whether it's complexity, breadth, depth, future, past, integration. Yeah, but being a better thinker. And I thought that and did a PhD to prove it. I did a PhD on developmental psychology and futures. So, yeah. But the other thing, Marcus, was that you did this by talking to people, or you did this by listening to people talking about it.
Yeah.
And so while there was this big brain idea of futures, which is still there, there's also this conversational thing. And I used to do a thought piece with the students. I said, if you closed all the futures courses around the world, if you burnt all the futures books, 24 hours, people would sit around and say, what's happened? And then I reckon after 24 hours, it'd start again. And the way it would start is people would go and say, let's go and have a cup of coffee. And you would start as Futures is. You would start by talking to someone. You'd either have a book like I had, or you'd have a name, or you'd call up Richard Slaughter, or you'd call up Sahel Intula, or you'd call up Jim Data, or you'd write them a letter. But you would find someone to talk to about this idea, passion, worry, anxiety, crazy, whatever. But it's in that conversation. And as I've learnt more and more, Marcus, it's not always the conversation you're having. A powerful part of this is hearing conversation. You don't actually even need to be in the conversation, which is why I loved the FuturePod format, because a lot of the time when you're learning this stuff, you're just sitting there with a kind of half an ear to a conversation. I can tell you a story. This is a true story. It happened with Joe and I at Swinburne, and one of our students is a person came to do the Masters of Foresight, but she'd never come to any orientation. She'd never ever, we didn't know she was on the radar to come and do the course. She was just there in the first class. And I remember said to her, how the heck did you find out about the course? And what it was, she was walking through the building that Joe and I were in, and Joe and I had offices that faced out to the hallway.
Okay.
And so we'd have conversations where we talked to the hallway, and the other person would hear you. So we'd actually talk to the space.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, you could imagine with Joe Voros and I, we were ranging over Wilbur,
All
cosmology,
sorts of stuff.
spiritual development, goodness knows what. So this person was walking down the hall and heard this peculiar conversation coming out of nowhere because there are no people having the conversation. And she stopped to tie up a shoelace. And she said, I didn't have any shoe. I didn't have shoe with laces, but I still stopped to tie the shoelace up because she wanted to hear this conversation. And she
Oh,
sat there tying up an imaginary shoelace. And after, I don't know how long she was there for because we didn't see her and she couldn't see us,
I love
she
it.
decided that she wanted to do the course that these people were talking about.
What a fantastic story. So the conversation, the human voice, in a sense, even, I think it carries its own frequencies, and that's something that I felt, with your the Future Pod X, this idea of letters to the future, and the crafting of that new series. The voice actually really matters. Listening to the voice of the people. I haven't listened to your latest one, but I've listened to the previous two before that. The voices of let's say Sonia. The modulation in the voice, and all of this matters to me. Maybe partly because I'm a musician, but I really think you're right. There's something about what we're doing now, isn't there?
Yeah. When I taught methods back in the Master of Futures days, I used to start off teaching methods as methods. But quickly I kind of thought, that's kind of, it's useful, but it's not, it's actually important where the method came from. And so I invented a lecture called Concepts and Characters. So when I would teach CLA, I would teach about Sahel. When I would teach about Jim Data's laws, I would teach them about Jim. When I would do the T cycle, I would teach them a bit about Richard. When, and I teach them about, Ryan Eisler and other people.
Yeah.
Because the person and the method are together.
Yes.
They're not separate. Yes, there's a methodology, and yes, there's a person who originated it. But if you understand the methodology through the person and their story, then, because we are a community of characters.
Yeah.
It's one of the charms of our field is that we are idiosyncratic to know, I'm over 200 interviews into podcast, with FuturePod. I don't know how many different people I've spoken to, but everybody's got a story, a path, which is unique to them.
Absolutely.
And so, I think the personalities are both central to how we do the work. It's also central to where our art and craft emerges from. And there's a stinger coming. It's also the limit that we have to get past.
Yeah.
And FuturePod X, which has been a variation of FuturePod, is that often when I talk to really smart people, and these are incredibly smart people, we're talking about some of the most amazing thinkers you can come across. They are brilliant, and they're also, I'm not going to say trapped in their view of the world, but cognitive intelligence is kind of constrained by what you believe. And when we hear the voice, we hear the things that people say, I think what you're referring to, Marcus, is that we're hearing the humanity in the person, the emotion in the person, the passion in the person, because that is both the fuel for how they think, but it also is the kind of energetic, wellspring of how they find the encouragement to keep going. Because as you know, at the same time, this work is difficult in the sense that we often have to think about futures that we don't want to come to fruition. But at the same time, we often have to wrestle with organizations and bureaucracies that just want to manage the past.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So for me, listening to you, I have two things. One that comes up is this question of, I guess, an individual sense of spiritual purpose in life.
Yeah.
And I'm jumping in memory now to the second of the Future Pod X's that I listened to with Bhavana. And she sang. So she used her voice to sing what's it called, a Rabindranath Sangeet,
Yeah.
which is a song written by Rabindranath Tagore, great Indian poet, visionary politician too, for that matter. And that song speaks of yearning, and as you know, that's key to my sort of feeling is what do we yearn for? So I'm hearing this in what you're doing. So FuturePod X, can you give us a brief on really how come, and Frank Spencer's with you, and Frank's going to be he's lined up for an interview I think next week, so we'll get both sides of the story because it's a really interesting story. Can you tell us about the genesis of this X bit that comes in there?
Yeah. I suppose I'm just going to step back and explain FuturePod before we jump to the X,
Okay,
because
yeah. Okay.
I mean, for the people that are, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to start talking to all the people before they, particularly the older generations, before they happen to pass off,
Yeah.
was I wanted them in their own words to tell their own story, and I wanted them to talk about their methods that they're most passionate about, and I wanted them to explain who they were, where they came from, how they think, and how they do this. So that was FuturePod, which is I want to put a person and I want to hear Marcus's story and I want to hear Sahail's story and Jim Data's story and Richard Yeah, so I want their personal story.
Yeah.
So that's the FuturePod, and I encourage anyone kind of learning into the field to just go in and just listen to these people. I've got conversations now going back, it's probably 6-7 years now. So, and that's when you hear a person tell their story, which is inspirational. They give you pathways, they give you references, they tell you the tools, they make everything available. Beautiful. The second thing that I started to do with FuturePod, not me alone, there's actually a bunch of us in FuturePod, was I wanted to record conversations between futurists. Because it's one thing to have a person talking to me, which is lovely and useful, but I wanted to hear the interlocutory process of when we are talking together, where we're actually doing bootstrapping, we're doing generative, we're doing brave, we're doing crazy, because it's how we talk to one another when we're in this space that I often say, while the content of our conversation is interesting, I think our process of conversation is actually more interesting. So that became this, well, can I bring two futurists together to have a conversation?
Yeah.
And so we called that the conversation series. And then when I then said, and this was the idea with Frank, which we started late last year, was let's have a continuous conversation where we're not having the conversation, we're part of a conversation. We share, we step into a conversation. You were the person who started the conversation, so we can blame you for it. But every person who comes into the conversation has a legacy, has a lineage that they can bring in. But every person brings in something unique, fresh, provocative, disruptive.
Yeah.
And then the conversation travels. And that's really what the X is about. The X is this idea that, again, our lives are not, I was born, I live, and I die. Yeah, that's true. That'll be my life and that'll be yours. That'll be anyone's. But your born was part of another life.
Yeah.
And when you die, you're not gone. Yeah, physically you're gone, but the people you touched, the ideas you passed, they keep going. And so at a broader level, that's how we live. We live with the realization of sudden and unexpected expiration. And that to me is what music and poetry wrestles with. The fact that we are amazing individual people and loving, caring, passionate, skillful people. Yeah. And we're going to dust. And
that's pretty cool.
How do you reconcile that amazing, brilliant, awe-inspiring people are compost,
Yeah,
but they're the compost for the next part.
that's right. And I love the image of the compost because I think any teacher is compost for their students, really. To me,
Totally.
that's the educator part, gives them something and they go and compost it in their own way. So that's beautiful. So yeah, I'm kind of the finitude and infinitude that, there's, and you call it the letters too, which I think is important because letters are like letters in the bottle, the famous metaphor. So there's a letter in the bottle and it might end up somewhere. It's a bit like the woman and her shoelaces that didn't exist. So she's walking through a space of potentiality, and her space was literally a space of potentiality. It's one of those, empty, typical institutional corridors, and she comes across a field of something, and that to me that's where you go to mystery.
Yeah.
So maybe the last thing I'd like you to talk about, Peter, because you've had 4 of the FuturePod X, you've got all that incredible legacy of all those conversations. The future, of course, is a mystery. We actually don't know what's going to happen. I don't know when I'm going to be real compost. For a start, I could walk out of here and, comet comes and lands on my head. What about mystery and the future, Peter? Can you speak to that in wherever you want to go with it, please?
Well, as I said, at one level, there is no mystery, Marcus.
Oh,
It is absolutely
certain.
There is no mystery. It is
Yeah.
certain. It is certain.
Yeah.
I probably don't use the term mystery. For me, the term I use is randomness, which
Oh,
I think I see randomness and mystery very, very close.
yeah.
To me, it was random that I sat next to Jan Lee Martin, had a book in my briefcase, pulled it out.
Yeah.
She saw the book. She chose to have a conversation with me. That's the important thing. That's the important thing. There was a series of random events. There's always randomness.
Yes.
Then there is the human, what the human injects into randomness. We don't do futures to take away randomness.
Yeah.
We don't do futures to take away mystery. But it's a mystery to me why Jan spoke to me. It probably was a mystery as to why Jan even decided to talk to this person she didn't know. It was, pulling all these things out of the briefcase. We do things. People do things. People touch us or we touch other people.
Yeah.
We could do it more deliberately. We could do it more purposefully. We could.
Yeah.
And part of, as you know, our practice is to become better human beings, to reach and touch more people while we have time, because we never know. We assume we always have time, and it might have been the one time, the one person. So I suppose mystery and randomness is tied up for me, Marcus, in the ability of humans to take randomness, happenstance, serendipity, and just put a bit of human magic and spark into the randomness. I don't know where this will go. I don't know what will happen next.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's only a next if I lean into it.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Peter. And I have to say, I didn't know Jan Lee Martin very well, but I admired her greatly. In fact, she's the kind of person you just automatically loved, and so to me, it's no mystery why she spoke to you, because she was a person who was basically in love with everybody and curious, and she was an arch networker and all the rest. So to me, I think this is a beautiful place to end. And of course, what's happening now is that everybody who's going to listen to this conversation or has listened to this conversation, we've sparked all these little things off. And FuturePod, definitely put it on your listening list for when you're driving down the highway or wanting something else to just take you this way or that way, because you must have interviewed well over 150 people. I know you've got 200 plus, but you've come back, you interviewed me twice, so there's
Yeah.
you double dip a little bit along the way. And that's interesting because, you know, we're always in a different place. But Peter, you know, your work is inspiring. I think it's terrific. And, you know, and given that, you know, you're going to live for at least another 20 years, we've got a lot of future pods to come, and we're looking forward to that and more of it. And I'm really grateful that you've given us the time for Little Futures 101. So any famous last words, Peter? I'll let you have.
No, once again, I think you've done it. I mean, you didn't have to create Futures 101. You know, you had encouragement to do it, you had impetus to do it, but you didn't have to do it. You have chosen to do it. You've chosen to take small part of your precious time that you have, because you don't have more time, and you have taken the handful of hours, days, you and Jeannie, and you're creating this thing. You have no idea where it's going to go. You have no idea what it's going to start. Because randomness, mystery kicks in.
It does.
But that's your investment, tiny investment, offering, your gift. And I really appreciate the fact that you have been as generous as you've been.
Thank you, Peter, and I'm appreciating your generosity too. You can tell we're in a sort of bromance here. There's kind of thing that goes on. So it's wonderful, and I want to thank you. And we'll end here and take a deep breath.
See you, mate.